Hello guys, welcome to Trumpet Ministry. We are back again, and remember, we are still in the book of Genesis. And today here we are going to discuss one of the subjects which is very crucial and most debated in the world and even within the church itself. Friends, please don't forget to subscribe and add your comment. Also, like and share the link with your friends, because this is very crucial, and we're actually beginning to discuss the uncomfortable subject. So I want you to make sure that you also become a channel of blessing to others who will be able to see the link on your statuses or even on your Facebook. Be blessed, as today we're going to talk about polygamy. You might be asking yourself, why is it so important to talk about polygamy? In my experience, my little experience, I have realized that this is actually a controversial subject, in a sense that the church members do not know how to deal with the subject. There is a confusion whether is it right or wrong. Sometimes some people say the church is wrong. Why? Because the church does not support polygamy. Church members within the church argue on this subject, whether is it something worthy of consideration or we should just reject it. So today, I want us to see where is this coming from, and why do we find ourselves, even those who believe in the Bible, using the same Bible as a weapon or as a supporter, as an advocate of this issue of polygamy. The statement that I'm going to read right now is extracted from the book called Doctrine and Covenants, page 132, and this is how it reads. Polygamy was first introduced into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which is called LDS Church, in 1843. Mark these words. And was declared an official policy in 1852. That's where we start. In 1980, after when polygamy has been outlawed in the United States of America, the Latter-day Church, which is LDS Church, issued a manifesto ending polygamy as a practice endorsed by the church. So you see where we are beginning this issue. And also, if we look at the world religion of Islam, with its almost 1 billion adherents, does not limit the male partner in marriage to a single spouse. In fact, Muslims are permitted to have up to 4 wives at one time. This practice has resulted in difficulties for Christian missionaries. As one researcher in Islam put it in this simple way, this is what he said. Throughout the history of Muslim-Christian interaction, polygamy has been a point of deep division between the two groups. Polygamy has been an issue, and we can't deny this. The book of Genesis, friends, provides a concrete account of the institution of marriage. It is therefore wise for us to go to the book of Genesis. As I highlighted in other episodes, that the book of Genesis is actually the origin of everything. It talks about God's original design of how he wanted humanity to live. Now, in the first chapters of the Bible, the question of human sexuality is directly dealt with somehow. One thing that God established in chapter 1 is that things were very good, that which he created. In chapter 2, marriage was actually perfect. God instituted it. In chapter 3, something entered into this planet. So God's original design is now marred by who? By Lucifer. Now from chapter 3 onwards, we then begins to see certain things that were not part of God's original plan. Now, one writer indicates this, that the historicity of the Genesis account is accepted. On this basis, friends, an attempt is made in this video to examine the two beginnings as recorded in the first few chapters. Actually, it's the first chapter up to chapter 9 of Genesis. In chapter 2, verse 18 and verse 21, then the Lord God said, "It is not good for the man to be alone. This is God speaking, I will make him a helper suitable for him." Marriage in the first chapters of Genesis actually involved a divine dimensions. Why am I saying this? In chapter 1, verse 27, says that God created them. And then the Bible says male and female. And what did he do? He charged them to be fruitful and multiply. That's in verse 28. Now, this implied marital relationship. So you see the fruitful and multiply. That's chapter 1. Then in chapter 2, verse 18 records the words of God, where God says, I will make him a helper. In other words, it was God who decided to create a suitable companion. He did not get that. It was God who decided to create a suitable helper, a suitable companion, a suitable wife to Adam. Interesting. Now pay attention to them. To Adam or to the man. Then it was God who brought her to man. Right? It was God who brought the woman to the man. And those are the things that we see. And then to be his wife. Thus, both passages specifically state that God is the originator of marriage relationship. I like what William Blum said about the Old Testament creation account. He said that monogamy is the form of marriage willed by God from the beginning. He also argued that it is not simply a cultural institution dependent upon the customs and conditions of a particular society. That's what he said. He said monogamy was actually instituted by God, right? And he continues arguing that it is not simply a cultural custom or a cultural institution. What that means is that marriage is not based on the cultural norms. It is not originated by a society. It is originated by God himself. But interesting that even prophetess Ellen White, she said the following: God celebrated the first marriage. Thus, the institution has for its originator the creator of the universe. Wow. Now, from the book of Genesis, I want us to look at something. Genesis chapter 2. Let's observe Genesis chapter 2, verse 21 to 24. Because it becomes clear here that this marriage took place between one man and one woman. Follow me very well here. The repeated use of singular nouns and pronouns in this passage is something worthy of consideration. God decides to make a helper for the man. That is verse 18 of Genesis chapter 2. He selects one rib from the man. From the man, he selects one rib. That's verse 21. And he fashions it into a woman. So the rib, he makes a woman out of the rib. And pay attention, not women, woman out of the rib, not ribs. And then, he later on then took that woman to the man. That is verse 22. Then the man says that she shall be called woman. So from this Genesis account, it is very clear that God's original design is monogamy, not polygamy. I wanted to set that foundation before we go far. For Moses has not said that God designed wives for Adam. But we only find that God only designed one. One man, one woman. And in the general direction given, He had put the wife in the singular number, not wives as plural. It remains therefore that the conjugal bond subsists between two persons only. Whence it easily appears that nothing is less accordant with the divine institution than polygamy. What did I say, friends? I said that the conjugal bond subsists between two persons only. Why am I saying only? Because it says the two shall be one flesh. Not the three, the two. One flesh. This is what we find from this guy called Perinda in his conclusion of analyzing Genesis, which is stated that Genesis account rights of the first marriage in clearly monogamous. Monogamous terms, And he concludes by saying that the fact that the first human beings are represented as having been one man with one wife clearly sets up monogamy as the original intention of God for the human race. And I like what the prophet has said in the book called Youth Instructor, 10 August 1899, page 437. She says the following: this first marriage is an example of what all marriages should be. Friend, wait a bit. She says that. She said this first marriage is an example of what all marriages should be. God gave the man one wife. Had he deemed it best for man to have more than one wife, he could easily have given him two, but he sanctioned no such thing. Interesting. He sanctioned no such thing. My point is, she said this particularly, this one, is the example for all marriages. God called Noah to build the ark. I want us to observe this. God called Noah to build an ark. And as he called Noah to build an ark was then built to preserve selected animals and human beings who made it there. Right. Now, the record simply states that that when the ark and all the necessary preparations have been made, right, they had been made, and we're told that Noah, and it records Noah and Shem and Ham and Japheth, the sons of Noah, and Noah's wife, and the 3 wives of his sons with them entered the ark. That is Genesis 7 verse 13. And that actually in the ark, there were precisely 8 persons saved. It's clearly recorded in both testaments, the Old and the New. In the book of 1 Peter chapter 3 verse 5, 1 Peter chapter 3 verse 20, 2 Peter chapter 2 verse 8, the Bible is very clear. 2 Peter chapter 2 verse 5, the Bible is very clear that 8 people were saved. Right, now that is very, very crucial. Now on this issue, the prophetess continues that Noah had but one wife, and their united family discipline was blessed of God, because Noah's sons were righteous. They were preserved in the ark with their righteous father. And God, all right, they were actually preserved. And the people who made it to the ark, they were not polygamists. They were monogamists. Noah was a monogamist, if I were to put it that way. His 3 sons were monogamists. There was no polygamist who made it to the new world. I hope that is clear. So you can see that God has not sanctioned polygamy in a single instance. This issue of polygamy is contrary to his will. So that's the observation. We're observing chapter 1 and 2, and we observe chapter 6. Now, I want us to reverse back now And we are reversing back to chapter 4 and 5. And this becomes the very crucial issue here. I would like us to look at these two genealogies that are presented because they're very, very crucial to us, most especially as we are trying to figure out what is God's will regarding this issue of polygamy. Should we then, as people of God, succumb to accepting this ideology that God sanctioned this? It does not matter how many wives you have. And if therefore God does not sanction that, it means that our way of dealing or discussing this issue, we cannot say it's about your conscience. Why? If God said no, then I cannot say this is just a conscience thing. You don't have to worry. Because, when you don't know how to deal with the matter. And I know that we think we're studying. Now, when reading Hebrew writings, we want to understand, to consider something which is very, very crucial here. The significance of Hebrew style of writing, Hebrew names, and even the significance of numbers. In the Bible, those things matter. So you don't just bypass them. You really have to sit down and analyze them. So now, it is generally believed that, example, the number 1 represents unity, right? And number 4 represents 4 corners of the earth. And the number 7 represents perfection or completeness. Perfection and completeness. Now, with that in mind, in other words, when God counts up to 7, he ends. You have the 7th day of the week. He counted from day 1 to day 6. When he get to day 7, he said, okay, it's done now. It's time to rest. So you have this number 7 repeated a lot. In the Bible, you have the 7 churches. In Revelation, you have 7 seals. In the same book of Revelation, 7 trumpets. And you have the 7 plagues. Now, the Bible is full of the number 7, 7 years, 7 feasts, and so forth. You can count them. You can count them. Children of Israel, when they were surrounding Jericho and wanted the city to fall, they surrounded the city. They went around the city how many times? 6 times. And on the 7th time, the city came down. So the number 7 is very, very crucial. So, and guess what? In Genesis chapter 4 and chapter 5, we want to employ the same principle of the number 7 with regard to this issue of polygamy. And you'll be surprised on what we're going to find. Now, here's the idea, and this is going to get interesting. I'm winding to close, friends. In Genesis chapter 4, the Bible tells us about Cain, right? How sin came, but then it later on talks about the descendants of Cain. So please go and read it for yourself. In Genesis chapter 5, how Genesis chapter 4 ends, it ends by introducing us to chapter 5. So chapter 5, then we have people who were calling on the name of the Lord. In chapter 4, we have people who were not calling on the name of the Lord. If you count these people who are mentioned from the line of Cain and the line of Seth, you realize if you count and you make the first man, which is Adam, you count from Adam. Adam begat Cain, and Cain, Enosh, until you get to Lamech. You realize that Lamech is the 7th man. If you count the same thing in chapter 5 from Adam, Adam begat Seth. Seth, right? Because it counts people from Adam. It's the first man. If you count 7 men from Adam, you will get to Enoch. Now, this is what for me it's interesting. So if you were to picture a graph, in the graph you will find that one line is going up, which is represented by chapter 5, and one line is going down, which is represented by chapter 4, right? So you have 2 genealogies. One genealogy is growing upward towards heaven, and one genealogy is growing downwards towards hell, if I may put it that way. So the first genealogy recorded, which is chapter 5, you count Adam until to Lamech. Lamech becomes the 7th man. And when you come to Lamech, you realize that Lamech introduced polygamy. Interesting. The first recorded polygamy is found in the book of Genesis chapter 4, by the way. And it was introduced by the genealogy. It was coming from the genealogy that was growing downwards. It was growing away from God. The same genealogy that was growing away from God is the same genealogy that introduced the concept of polygamy. Then you go to chapter 5. This is the genealogy which is growing towards heaven. You get to the man, number 7 man. You have both sides, you have man number 7. When you get to man number 7, this is what you get. You have Enoch, who walked with God so much that God took him. Then when you get to man number 7 on the genealogy of Cain, you get to Lamech, who introduced the polygamy and violence. You see, this is the man who introducing many things and is building cities. So all those things are happening. So this guy has nothing to do with heaven. They are growing downwards. And in the other genealogy, you have this man who was so perfect. So the number 7, as I indicated, is completeness, it's perfection. So it's like so in other words, since the number 7 represents completeness or perfection, the other genealogy that was growing heavenward, when we reach number 7, man was perfect. That it would not have been good for God to let that man live here on earth. God saw it fit to take him. The 7th man was taken. The 7th man, from the other genealogy, he introduced violence, polygamy. That's where polygamy began. Right? And I don't know how can we say that it's fine. That's where polygamy. Hence, friends, in Genesis chapter 6, we have this genealogy of God mingling with so degraded man of moral decline, mingling and intermarrying. It means, therefore, that the fall of the sons of God, looking at the women who were coming from the descendants of Cain, did not begin in chapter 6. It actually started from Genesis chapter 5, verse 33 to verse 39. Actually, verse 33 to verse 93, which Moses did not record. If you get what I mean. It means between chapter 5 and chapter 6, a lot happened which is not recorded. Where the sons of God, the same genealogy that we read about, how holy they were, there was a lot that was going on that they began to mingle until now. When you get to chapter 6, the mingling was so bad that God could not tolerate. Because why? Prophetess of the Lord tells us that polygamy was introduced. One of the key things that made God to even destroy those people, polygamy was part of it. If polygamy was part of it, it makes sense now why Jesus said, as it was in the days of Noah, they were eating, drinking, and marrying. Marrying. What's wrong with marriage? But when you look at this, you realize that, no, he served the people who were well married, but there are those whose marriage was not in harmony with God's will. So for me, again, from these words of Jesus recorded in Matthew chapter 24, it tells me that Jesus is presenting to us the story of Noah as a typology of the end time generation. That in the end time generation, you will have those who are represented by Noah, and then you will have those who are going to behave like those who did not make it to the ark. So we looked at how God originally instituted this and God's original design, and then sin came and marred God's original design. However, God then select these descendants, and then there's another descendants of Cain and another descendants of Seth, and these two groups, they are not to be together. Then as time goes by, you have the people of God mingling with these people, and then the flood came. And those who were saved, they were monogamists instead of polygamists. That's interesting. Then you move chapter 10 and 11. A lot happened there, which, of course, we do not have time to go into it in details. But one thing that you see is that these people, by the way, there was a lot of idolatry that was coming right from these nations which were born. Right. So the father and the grandfather of Abraham, they were surrounded by idolatry, and God then comes in chapter 12 calling Abraham out of idolatry. And this, of course, makes sense for us to look at that, of course, if you're surrounded by this idolatry, you get affected, right? So we're getting to Abraham, and Abraham, therefore, he get married to this woman by the name of Sarah, and then they obeyed God's voice. They went wherever God called them to go, in the land of Canaan. And later on, it happened that for the lack of faith that he had and his wife had, the wife suggested that he marry the maid, her maid, so that at least she may give them the child. God said, you are going to have a child, but not from me, but at least if it's your child. This has nothing to do with me, but you. Of course, later on, God says, you, Sarai, you will have a child. But one thing that if you observe, you realize that cultural speaking, during that time, it was actually customary that the wife could actually ask. They will arrange such marriages so that the maid may bear children for the man, right? And the women will actually allow that to happen. This was just a custom. It was not written anyway. Although there was no written. There was nothing written by then. Now here's the idea. Then Abraham, he then married Hagar. But one thing, when you observe the book of Genesis, you do not see Abraham calling Hagar my wife. He calls Sarah his wife. What about the angel of the Lord? When Hagar was kicked out, when the angel found her, you know what the angel said? When God met Hagar, God does not say, go back to your husband, Abraham. No. God says, go back to your maid. Hagar, although there were arranged marriages that took place so that Abraham may at least have a child, which is they got Ishmael. We know from the Bible, it never stated anywhere. I think Moses did that intentionally. Never stated anywhere that Abraham ever called Hagar his wife. She was always addressed as the maid of his servant, of his wife. In other words, to God, she was not Abraham's wife. To Abraham, he will say, is my wife, but he never said it there. It's not recorded anyway. But what is recorded is what we are to live with. So God never said, Hagar is your wife. She was never addressed as Sarah's maid to Abraham. So Abraham should have understood very well that this one is not my wife. Heaven does not recognize Hagar as your wife. Sarah's maid. What I wanted us to learn, friends, is that polygamy, from its inception, it was actually an indication of moral decline. It was not endorsed by heaven. From its inception, it has been a sign of moral decline. And therefore, you can put your questions and comments, and please don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this with other people. Put your comments here and we can discuss. You can share your view, but from the Genesis account, this is what I have. And we can actually go a little bit more. I've shared this because we can spend even hours discussing the same thing. I hope you will be blessed. Thank you so much for taking your time to watch this. May God bless you.